What if the home you just bought, the one you stretched your budget for, the one you're planning to raise your family in, turned out to be nearly worthless in 20 years? Not because of a recession, not because of rising interest rates, but because there's simply no water left to sustain it. That's not a hypothetical. It is already happening in parts of the United States right now. Here's what nobody in the real estate industry wants to talk about openly. For decades, home prices have been built on an invisible assumption that water will always flow when you turn on the faucet. That assumption is cracking. Across the American West and even parts of the South and Southeast, water supplies are shrinking faster than population growth is slowing down. Aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being drained in a matter of decades. Reservoirs that once served as a region's lifeline are now barely holding on. And here's the devastating part for homeowners and investors: the real estate market hasn't priced this in yet. In this video, we're going to look at 10 specific U.S. cities where water scarcity isn't a distant warning. It's an active, measurable threat that has the power to fundamentally destabilize home values, freeze new construction, and leave millions of residents holding properties in places that can no longer sustain them. We'll go city by city, look at the data, break down what it means for buyers and investors, and explain why water may be the single most undervalued risk factor in American real estate today. Stay until the end, because the number one city on this list has already crossed a line no American city has ever crossed before. And it stopped building homes because the water is gone. Let's get into it. Number 10, Miami, Florida. The luxury market built on salt water. Most people hear Miami and think of wealth, waterfront views, and endless sunshine. Real estate there has been on a tear, luxury condos selling in the tens of millions, buyers flocking from the Northeast, from Latin America, from Europe. On the surface, Miami looks bulletproof, but underneath the surface, literally a slow-motion disaster is unfolding. Nearly 3 million people in the Miami metro area depend on a single freshwater source, the Biscayne Aquifer. This underground reservoir of fresh water, stored in porous limestone beneath South Florida, has supplied the region for over a century. But as sea levels rise, salt water from the Atlantic Ocean is creeping inland, not just along the surface, underground. This process, called saltwater intrusion, is silently contaminating the aquifer from below. Once saltwater invades a freshwater aquifer, reversing the damage is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has already committed hundreds of millions of dollars to build underground barriers and inject fresh water back into the system. NOAA projects sea levels around Miami could rise by up to 2 feet by 2050. If that happens, the intrusion accelerates sharply. Now ask yourself the real estate question: what is a $5 million waterfront condo truly worth if the region's only drinking water source is being steadily consumed by the ocean? Engineers can buy time, they cannot buy permanence. Miami's housing market is priced as if the water problem doesn't exist. That disconnect between price and reality is the definition of a bubble waiting to be corrected. Number 9, Atlanta, Georgia, a booming city at the center of a legal war over water. Atlanta feels like a city with no ceiling. Fortune 500 headquarters, a massive airport, a growing tech presence, and one of the fastest growing metro populations in the Southeast. Investors love it. Developers love it. But beneath all that momentum is a water supply that's been the subject of one of the longest and most expensive legal battles in American history. Atlanta draws most of its water from Lake Lanier, a reservoir within the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River Basin, a system shared by Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. For years, those three states have been locked in court fighting over who gets how much water. And the legal bills alone have surpassed $100 million. The U.S. Supreme Court has stepped in multiple times and still hasn't fully resolved it. During severe drought periods, Lake Lanier has dropped to alarming lows, exposing submerged roads and foundations from communities flooded when the reservoir was originally created decades ago. The Atlanta Regional Commission estimates the metro could add nearly 3 million more residents by 2050. That's 3 million more people competing for water from a reservoir that is already contested at current population levels. If a future court ruling forces Georgia to cut back significantly on its water withdrawals, or if a prolonged drought pushes the reservoir into crisis, Atlanta's growth engine stalls. Construction moratoriums become realistic. Our home values in the outermost growth corridors, built on the assumption that water infrastructure will always keep up, become vulnerable. Atlanta's housing market looks strong, but it's playing a high-stakes game on borrowed water. Number 8, Denver, Colorado. The Mountain West Dream. Running out of snowpack, Denver has been one of the hottest real estate markets in the country for the past decade. Home prices roughly doubled, tech workers flooded in, suburbs expanded into the high plains. The Mile High City became a symbol of modern American prosperity. That prosperity runs on Colorado River water, and the Colorado River is in serious trouble. Denver Water, the city's municipal provider, draws more than half its supply from the Colorado River basin through an elaborate system of tunnels, pipes, and reservoirs that redirect snowmelt from the western side of the Rockies to the drier eastern plains where Denver sits. For generations, consistent mountain snowpack made this work reliably, but mountain snowpack has been on a persistent decline over the past 2 decades, driven by warmer temperatures and shifting precipitation patterns. The federal government has responded by issuing unprecedented shortage declarations on the Colorado River, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, mandating cuts across multiple states. Denver Water holds senior water rights, meaning it sits ahead of many others in line, but senior rights don't conjure water that doesn't exist. You can't deliver what the mountains didn't produce. Denver Water is investing over $500 million to expand Gross Reservoir, hoping to capture more water in wet years and bank it against dry ones. It's a responsible step. But it's also a sign that the old supply model is no longer reliable enough to sustain the future being built on top of it. Denver's suburbs keep growing, developers keep building, but the fundamental bet that a river system under extraordinary worsening strain can keep pace with uncapped growth is a bet that deserves a much harder look from anyone buying into this market. Number 7, Austin, Texas. Tech boom meets water bust. Austin is one of the defining real estate stories of the past decade. Tesla, Oracle, Apple, Samsung, the corporate migration transformed this mid-sized Texas city into a high-octane economic engine, and housing prices followed accordingly. But while headlines celebrated the growth, the lakes that give Austin its waterfront character were quietly dropping. Austin depends on 2 man-made reservoirs, Lake Travis and Lake Buchanan, fed by Texas's own Colorado River, a completely separate river from the one out west. These aren't natural lakes with stable levels, they're reservoirs that fluctuate with rainfall and usage, and in recent years the combined storage of these reservoirs has fallen below 35% of capacity, a level that water managers treat as a serious warning thresholds. Last summer, Austin endured more than 45 consecutive days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That kind of sustained extreme heat does 2 damaging things simultaneously. It dramatically accelerates evaporation from already depleted reservoirs, and it spikes demand as residents fight to stay cool and keep landscaping alive. Research from Texas A&M University suggests that if the Austin region experiences a drought comparable to the severe one that struck in the 1950s, the city's water supply could reach a critical breaking point within 10 years. 10 years? In real estate terms, that's not the distant future. That's within the lifetime of a standard 30-year mortgage. Properties with waterfront designations, the ones that commanded serious premiums just a few years ago, are already drawing more cautious buyers as those bodies of water retreat. When the water feature in waterfront property starts looking like a dry canyon, the premium attached to it starts looking like a liability. Number 6, San Antonio, Texas, an invisible crisis beneath the surface. Drive through San Antonio and nothing looks immediately alarming. It's a thriving or growing city, one of the largest in the country by population. But its water supply is almost entirely invisible. More than 90% of San Antonio's water is pulled from underground, from the Edwards Aquifer, an enormous system of fresh water stored in porous limestone deep beneath the Texas Hill Country. For a long time, the Edwards Aquifer seemed like the perfect resource, clean, abundant, and naturally filtered. But San Antonio has grown dramatically, and that growth means withdrawals are now outpacing the natural recharge rate. Rain is refilling the aquifer more slowly than residents and businesses are draining it. The Edwards Aquifer Authority monitors a key indicator well. When levels fall below certain thresholds, automatic conservation stages are triggered. San Antonio has already entered Stage 4 restrictions, among the most stringent, limiting non-essential water use significantly. U.S. Geological Survey data confirms a long-term declining trend in aquifer levels. The consequences reach beyond convenience. The Edwards Aquifer feeds iconic natural springs in the region. If water levels drop too low, those springs could slow to a trickle or stop entirely, threatening protected species and damaging a tourism economy worth billions. The city is spending billions of dollars on diversification efforts, including a pipeline to import water from a different aquifer over 100 miles away. Those costs translate directly to rate increases on resident utility bills. Here is the real estate reality. San Antonio's housing market is built on top of a water supply you cannot see, measure with your eyes, or easily replace. When the water beneath a city is the only water it has, and that water is measurably declining, the question every prospective homebuyer should be asking is not, what's the neighborhood like, but what is the aquifer level at the monitoring well right now? Number 5, Salt Lake City, Utah. When the water problem becomes an air problem. The Great Salt Lake is the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere. It has been central to the ecology, economy, and identity of Utah for as long as the state has existed, and it is disappearing at a pace that scientists call unprecedented. A combination of aggressive water diversion for agriculture and development, compounded by prolonged drought, has resulted in the lake losing more than 70% of its total water volume over the past half-century. What remains is a fraction of what once existed that creates two separate but connected crises for the housing market. First, it reflects a broader regional water shortage serious enough to trigger strict conservation rules and force difficult trade-offs between agricultural, industrial, and residential users. There simply isn't enough water flowing into the basin to sustain current demand levels. Second, and potentially even more alarming, as the lake bed dries and is exposed, decades of accumulated industrial pollutants, arsenic, mercury, lead, are embedded in that sediment. When winds blow across the exposed lake bed, they pick up that contaminated dust and carry it directly toward the metro area. The Utah Department of Environmental Quality has issued repeated air quality alerts tied to this toxic particulate matter. Health researchers have linked prolonged exposure to elevated risks of respiratory illness, certain cancers, and neurological damage. Think about what that means for real estate. You now have a market where water is increasingly scarce and where the air itself carries measurable health risks tied to the environmental collapse of a nearby natural landmark. Utah's legislature has committed over $1 billion in emergency measures to try to restore water flow to the lake. Scientists are not optimistic that it's enough or fast enough. A housing market is ultimately a bet on a place being livable and desirable for decades. Salt Lake City's answer to that test is becoming harder to give with confidence. Number 4, Los Angeles, California. The engineered illusion at scale Los Angeles is one of the most expensive real estate markets on the planet. It's also, in hydrological terms, a desert city of 12 million people kept alive entirely by water imported from hundreds of miles away. This is not an exaggeration. The city's own local water supply is negligible relative to its demand. Nearly 85% of Los Angeles's water is imported, from Northern California via the State Water Project and from the Colorado River via the Colorado River Aqueduct. Both of those pipelines are under severe stress. The State Water Project allocates water based on how much snowpack accumulates in the Sierra Nevada each winter. In recent years, agencies have received allocations as low as 5% of their original requests. When snow doesn't fall or melts too fast, the pipeline runs thin. On the Colorado River side, mandatory federal shortage declarations have already cut the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California's allocation by hundreds of thousands of acre-feet. The agency declared a formal water shortage emergency, the first in its history, and restricted nearly 6 million residents to outdoor watering just once per week. Los Angeles is investing aggressively in water recycling, stormwater capture, and groundwater replenishment. These are the right moves, but many experts estimate these projects are a decade or more behind where they need to be to compensate for what's being lost from imported supplies. The trillion-dollar question for LA real estate is this: a market where 85% of the water comes from outside, from systems under documented and worsening strain. It is a market carrying enormous hidden risk. That risk isn't reflected in home prices on the west side of Los Angeles or in luxury hillside developments. Pricing usually adjusts to reality eventually. In real estate, eventually can be brutal. Number 3, San Diego, California. The most exposed market in America, if Los Angeles is heavily dependent on outside water, San Diego is even more so. Nearly 90% of San Diego's water supply is imported, and unlike Los Angeles, which at least has the scale and infrastructure to pursue multiple alternative strategies simultaneously, San Diego is heavily concentrated in one place. The Colorado River. San Diego holds some of the most junior water rights on the river. In water law, junior means you're at the back of the line. When shortage declarations force cuts, junior rights holders absorb the largest reductions. Senior holders upstream are protected first. San Diego gets what's left. In response to this vulnerability, the San Diego County Water Authority made a massive bet. It invested over $1 billion to build the Claude desalination plant, which converts Pacific Ocean seawater into drinkable water. It was celebrated as a breakthrough in drought-resistant supply. The plant is real, and it functions, but it provides only about 10% of the region's total water demand, and the water it produces costs nearly double the price of imported Colorado River water, directly pushing San Diego's residential water rates to among the highest in the country. San Diego already ranks as one of the least affordable housing markets in the United States. See, layer on top of that some of the country's highest water bills, a structural dependence on the most contested river in America, and junior rights status that makes the city among the first to face cuts. And you have a market carrying compounding financial risk that most buyers are not fully pricing into their purchase decisions. Real estate markets in San Diego are fundamentally tied to a water situation that is fragile by design. The billion-dollar desalination plant is insurance for 10% of the problem. The other 90% is still very much an open question. Number 2, Las Vegas, Nevada. A city that runs on a disappearing lake. No American city better illustrates the intersection of water scarcity and real estate risk than Las Vegas. More than 90% of the city's entire water supply flows from a single reservoir, Lake Mead, formed by Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Lake Mead has declined to levels that a generation ago would have been considered catastrophic. The famous bathtub ring, the white mineral stain on the canyon walls showing where the water used to sit, now towers more than 100 feet above the current surface in some areas. The Bureau of Reclamation has measured the reservoir at around 28% of capacity. At one point, the original water intake pipe from the 1970s was literally left hanging in dry air as the water line retreated past it. The Southern Nevada Water Authority responded by drilling a new, deeper intake tunnel, the third straw, at a cost of over $1.5 billion, essentially an engineering gamble to access water even if the lake keeps falling. Las Vegas has also implemented some of the most aggressive conservation policies of any American city, banning decorative grass, offering rebates to remove lawns, enforcing strict usage limits. Per capita water use has dropped substantially. The conservation effort is genuine and meaningful. But here is the brutal math. Conservation reduces how fast you drain the glass. It does not refill the glass, and Lake Mead continues to decline. The Las Vegas housing market has been extraordinarily hot in recent years. New construction, appreciation, investor interest. The city's real estate scene has reflected its broader economic energy. Yet all of it, every casino, every luxury resort, every master plan suburb stretching into the desert, rests on a foundation anchored to a lake that federal officials now manage under permanent shortage conditions. Hope is not a water management strategy. A climate scientist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas reportedly said exactly that. It also isn't a real estate investment strategy. Number 1, Phoenix, Arizona. The first city to stop building because the water is gone. We've arrived, and nothing else on this list compares to what has happened in Phoenix. For decades, Phoenix was the archetype of American Sunbelt growth. The desert was conquered. The Central Arizona Project, a 300-mile canal system, carried Colorado River water into the valley and made mass development possible. Population exploded. Suburbs stretched further and further into the desert. Phoenix became one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in American history. Then two things happened that changed everything. First, Arizona's allocation of Colorado River water was slashed to near zero under federal shortage declarations. The lifeline that made Phoenix's growth possible was effectively running dry under federal mandate. Second, When developers pivoted to groundwater as their backup plan, drilling wells deeper into the desert earth to sustain subdivisions beyond the reach of existing infrastructure, the Arizona Department of Water Resources conducted a thorough decade-long assessment and reached a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the real estate industry. There is not enough groundwater beneath the Phoenix metropolitan area to support the housing developments that have already been approved. Ethan, the supply does not meet Arizona's legal requirement of a 100-year assured water supply, a threshold the state has required before permitting large-scale residential development. The response from state officials was immediate and historic, a halt on new home construction in several outlying Phoenix suburbs that could not demonstrate long-term water availability. This was not a pause. This was not a regulatory delay. This was a construction stop order driven entirely by the absence of water. According to research from the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, more than 80,000 previously approved housing units are now in legal and financial limbo. Billions of dollars in projected development already permitted, already marketed, in some cases already sold, are frozen. For anyone who bought a home in these affected outer ring communities, the question is no longer theoretical. What is your property worth if surrounding development is halted, long-term water security is legally unresolved, and potential buyers for your home in the future will face the same questions you're now facing? Phoenix is not a warning. Phoenix is what happens after the warning is ignored. We've traveled from Miami's saltwater intrusion to Atlanta's legal standoff to Denver's shrinking snowpack, through Texas's declining reservoirs and aquifers, past the toxic dust clouds rising from Utah's disappearing lake, through California's imported water crisis, and finally to Phoenix, where the water simply ran out. Every city on this list is still selling homes. Real estate agents in every one of these markets will hand you a listing sheet, show you comparable sales, and walk you through square footage and countertop upgrades. None of that information will tell you whether the water supply supporting that property can sustain it for the next 30 years. Water has never appeared on a standard home inspection checklist in most of these markets. It has not been a required disclosure item in most states. It has not been built into home valuations in any systematic or standardized way. That is beginning to change, but slowly and unevenly. Here is what every buyer, every investor, and every homeowner in the American West and Sunbelt should be doing right now. Researching the water source for any property they own or are considering. Is it surface water or groundwater? What is the current level? Is it declining? Are there active legal disputes over its use? Is the city or county investing in alternatives? And what will those alternatives cost residents in utility rates? Does the property sit in a growth area that depends on unconfirmed long-term water supplies? These are not exotic or obscure questions. They are the most fundamental questions about whether a place is livable, and therefore whether a property in that place holds long-term value. The cities on this list aren't failing. They are some of the most dynamic, economically vibrant places in America. But vibrancy built on a misunderstood or ignored resource constraint is fragile. The real estate industry has a long history of pricing assets based on visible, immediate characteristics and discounting slow-moving, invisible risks until they become crises. Water scarcity is not invisible anymore. It's at 28% capacity in Lake Mead. It's 70% gone in the Great Salt Lake. It's triggering construction halts in Phoenix. It's generating water rates in San Diego that make homeownership harder to afford than it already is. The question for every potential homebuyer and investor in these markets is not whether the water crisis is real. That debate is settled. The question is whether the price of the home you're considering reflects that reality yet. In most cases, it doesn't. That gap between price and reality is exactly where real estate corrections come from. If this analysis gave you something to think about, share this video with someone who is buying, selling, or investing in real estate in any of these markets. They need to see it. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the economic forces that the mainstream real estate conversation tends to overlook. And let us know in the comments, does your city have a water plan that gives you confidence? Or are you starting to ask questions you weren't asking before?